The first sound was not words but a gavel. Bang! The crack echoed like thunder through the crowded courtroom. And then, almost immediately, came the whisper that cut sharper than the judge's would. That quilt isn't fabric. It's family. Ethan Miller's voice was hoarse, trembling, but it carried. Every reporter, every juror, every stranger in the gallery felt the words hook into their chest. They all turned, not to the judge, not to the lawyers, but to the rectangle of fabric folded neatly inside a clear plastic evidence bag. It was nothing fancy. A patchwork quilt, faded colors stitched together from scraps of old shirts and dresses. Some seams had come undone. A few squares were frayed almost to nothing. Under the courtroom lights, it looked fragile, almost ordinary. Yet the moment the cameras flashed, it transformed. Not a piece of cloth anymore, but a ghost, a witness, a relic. The flashes struck its surface like lightning, reflecting off the threads. In that strobe of white light, the quilt seemed to breathe. Each square carried fingerprints invisible to the eye but undeniable to the heart. It wasn't evidence, Ethan thought. It was testimony. Silent testimony, louder than words. He remembered his grandmother's hands, spotted with age, pulling a needle through fabric under the yellow glow of a kitchen lamp. Every winter evening, the same sound. The quick snip of scissors, the soft swish of thread. She told him, "One day, this will keep you warm when I can't." He was 12. He didn't understand then, but he understood now. The courtroom, however, did not care about warmth. It cared about ownership, property, chain of custody. The law had boxes to tick, signatures to weigh. In legal terms, the quilt was an object, a possession, nothing more. But Ethan knew, and everyone in the room could feel, that this was no ordinary object. This was inheritance without paperwork, memory stitched into matter. A will that had never been notarized but had been spoken in every touch of thread. Across the aisle sat Jessica Hart. She didn't flinch under the cameras. Perfect hair, perfect jacket, a small smirk barely hidden at the corner of her mouth. She leaned toward her attorney and whispered something. The attorney nodded. Confidence radiated from her. To Jessica, the quilt wasn't family. It was leverage. A prize from the ruins of love. Something she could keep simply because she had it in her apartment when she left Ethan behind. The clash was stark. One man fighting for memory, one woman fighting for possession. One voice trembling, one voice polished. In that collision, the quilt became more than fabric. It became a mirror, showing what happens when power decides it can rewrite love. The gallery could sense it. A murmur ran through the crowd. This wasn't about one man's blanket. This was about something bigger. Every person had an heirloom somewhere. A photo album, a wedding ring, a recipe card with handwriting smudged by time. Everyone had something they feared might one day be dismissed as just an object. And if a court could strip Ethan Miller of his quilt, then what protection did anyone else have? The quilt became a national question. What counts as property? What counts as family? Can love be measured in fabric and thread? Ethan's words hung in the air, refusing to fade. That quilt isn't fabric. It's family. The line was repeated in the journalists' notebooks. It was typed into phones, tweeted, posted, whispered. A phrase destined to leave this courtroom and travel far beyond it. The judge adjusted her glasses. She struck the gavel again. Order in the court. But the gavel sounded weaker now, less commanding than one man's sentence about cloth and blood. Ethan looked down at his hands, still trembling. Wait. He had promised himself he would not cry. Not here, not in front of Jessica, not in front of the flashing lenses. His throat burned anyway. He thought of his grandmother's kitchen, the quilt still damp from fresh stitches draped over the back of a wooden chair. He thought of nights when he pulled it over his shoulders, the fabric heavy with her scent of lavender soap. And he thought of the day he opened his closet after Jessica moved out and found only dust, a rectangular shadow where warmth used to rest. Even dust remembers, he had whispered then. Even dust. The jury didn't know all of that yet, but they would. And the country watching on livestream would too, because this case wasn't about divorce or property division or petty spite. It was about memory on trial. This isn't a fight over fabric, Ethan's lawyer would later tell the court. This is a fight over legacy. But in truth, Ethan had already said it better than any attorney could. A single sentence had shifted the ground. He had turned a quilt into a battlefield and a mirror at once. What looked like an object was now a question. When love dies, who owns the past? No one moved for several seconds. The flashes dimmed, the silence stretched, and then, slowly, the trial began. But already the world outside had begun to take sides. Ethan Miller had never been the loudest man in the room. At 32, he was the kind of presence you almost missed at first glance. Tall but slightly hunched, polite but rarely effusive, a man who seemed to fold inward rather than sprawl outward. His co-workers at the Denver tech firm where he worked as a software engineer described him as steady, reliable, someone you could trust to meet a deadline and fix a broken line of code without fanfare. But they also noticed the shadows under his eyes, the way he lingered at his desk long after the office emptied, tapping aimlessly at a keyboard that no longer lit up with purpose. He had lost his mother at 7. Cancer. The memory of her face was a blur, not because he had forgotten, but because he had tried so hard to hold on to it that it slipped through his fingers. What remained instead were the hands of another woman, his grandmother, Agnes Miller. She became his anchor. She cooked his meals, checked his homework, walked him to school, and every winter she stitched warmth into fabric. The quilt was her masterpiece. 2 winters, dozens of worn-out shirts and dresses cut into squares, arranged with the precision of an artist and the tenderness of a guardian. The reds came from Ethan's mother's old flannel, the blues from his uncle's work shirts, a pale yellow from Agnes's own Sunday dress. Every piece carried a story sewn into a mosaic that was more than design, it was survival. Agnes had told Ethan, "One day, when I'm not here, this quilt will be." He believed her. When she passed away, Ethan inherited the quilt not by document, but by ritual. It was folded gently across his bed, waiting. No lawyer, no will, no fight. It simply belonged with him, the boy she had raised. But grief had a way of making him guarded. Ethan grew into a man who rarely spoke about feelings. He dated sparingly, kept conversations short, and when he did open his heart, it was in small bursts that faded quickly into silence. His friends knew he was kind, but they also knew he was distant. "He keeps everything inside," one college friend once said. "It's like he's always protecting something." What he was protecting, though few understood, was memory. At night, when insomnia gripped him, Ethan would sit at his laptop, staring at a blank status box on social media. Once, his fingers hovered over the keys and typed, "How do you fight for love when love is no longer here?" He never pressed post. The draft remained unsent, a question to no one, hidden in the glow of his screen. That was Ethan, the man who spoke to ghosts, not to crowds. Jessica Hart was different. At 29, she had already mastered the art of presence. A public relations professional in Denver's buzzing corporate scene, she knew how to command attention, to turn a room with her smile, her sharp laugh, her way of speaking in sound bites as if every conversation were a press release. She came from a family that prized image. Her father, a regional real estate developer, had always told her, "Perception is power." Jessica listened. She polished her words, her appearance, her persona. By the time she met Ethan at a mutual friend's party, she seemed unstoppable. Quick to debate, quick to charm, always the one who turned heads. Their romance had been improbable. The quiet engineer and the spotlight-loving PR agent. At first, their differences felt complementary. Ethan grounded Jessica, while Jessica coaxed Ethan into the world. She dragged him to rooftop parties, made him pose for Instagram, insisted he smile with teeth. He followed, because in her orbit, life felt louder, almost like living twice. But what drew her in at the start began to chafe later. His silences felt like judgment. His reluctance to share became, in her eyes, refusal. And when their relationship began to fray, Jessica did what she always did. She performed. She told friends, "He doesn't know how to love out loud." She told herself, "I gave him everything, and he gave me shadows." The breakup was not spectacular. No screaming, no betrayal, just exhaustion. But when Jessica packed her things, she made choices. Clothes, books, trinkets, and the quilt. She draped it over her shoulder like a shawl as she walked out. Ethan didn't stop her then. He stood in the doorway, frozen, the image seared into his mind. The quilt leaving with her felt like losing his grandmother all over again. Later, when Ethan called to ask for it back, Jessica's voice was cold. "It was given to both of us when we moved in together. It's part of my home now." "Jess, that's not true." "She made it for me, for family. And I was family once." To her, the quilt was not fabric either, but for different reasons. It was proof of her stake, her victory in a battle she refused to admit she had lost. If she let him reclaim it, she would feel erased, diminished. "If I let him have it," she told a friend one night at a downtown bar, swirling her martini, "he wins. I don't lose." The bar lights glowed against the glass as she leaned back, perfectly poised even in private. She had a way of turning pain into performance, of reframing a loss as control. It was not cruelty, not exactly. It was survival, the only way she knew. The contrast between them was sharp, almost theatrical. Ethan, silent, inward, rooted in memory. Jessica, loud, outward, rooted in perception. He carried grief like an heirloom. She carried image like armor. Their clash was inevitable. From the outside, it looked like a trivial dispute. An old quilt, 2 ex-lovers, a property disagreement. But the truth pulsed underneath. For Ethan, the quilt was life-preserved, his grandmother's final touch, the continuity of blood. For Jessica, it was proof of worth. A symbol she refused to surrender because surrender felt like erasure. It wasn't good versus evil. It was memory versus pride. Legacy versus possession. The quiet truth of the past against the loud claim of the present. The night before the first hearing, Ethan sat again at his laptop. The draft still glowed. How do you fight for love when love is no longer here? He stared at it, then closed the lid. He couldn't post it. He couldn't even answer it. But he knew, in the pit of his stomach, that the fight had chosen him. Across town, Jessica laughed with friends at another bar, retelling the story like a victory. "He thinks he's the only one with memories," she said, raising her glass. "Well, memories don't pay rent. Possession does." Her friends nodded, half amused, half uneasy. The quilt, folded in her apartment, heard none of it. But in silence, it carried every thread, every stitch of the life it had been built to protect. This was the setup. Two people, once intertwined, now locked in a struggle not over money or property, but over meaning. Ethan's silence against Jessica's spotlight, his quest for justice against her hunger for power, one man's plea for memory against one woman's refusal to lose. It was a battle destined to explode, not because of the quilt itself, but because the quilt revealed who they truly were. The apartment was almost bare when she left. The bookshelves that once overflowed with mismatched novels and framed photos now stood hollow, their dust speaking louder than silence. Jessica's shoes no longer lined the entryway. The scent of her citrus perfume, once clinging stubbornly to the curtains, had finally thinned. Ethan had prepared himself for the emptiness. Breakups, he told himself, are measured in absence. But what he hadn't prepared for was theft. Not theft of money or electronics. Those things could be replaced. What he lost was something irreplaceable. She had taken the quilt. He noticed it 2 days after she left. At first, he thought he had misplaced it during the chaos of separation, that maybe it had been tucked into a different closet or left in the laundry basket. But when he opened his bedroom wardrobe, the truth stared back. The shelf where the quilt always rested, top corner, folded neatly, a constant since his grandmother's death, was empty. A thin rectangle of undisturbed dust outlined its absence. Ethan pressed his palm against the dust shadow. The shape was precise, like chalk around a body at a crime scene. He dropped to the floor, his back against the wall, and whispered to no one. Even dust remembers. Why can't she? Tears came quickly, sharp and unrelenting. He hadn't cried the day Jessica left. He hadn't even cried at the end of their last argument, when she told him she couldn't live with his silences. But the absence of fabric undid him. The quilt was not hers to take. It was the one thing that tied him to the woman who had raised him, the woman whose hands had built his sense of safety stitch by stitch. For a long time, Ethan sat on the wooden floor, the sound of traffic outside leaking faintly through the window. And then came the piercing blast of a car horn, long, shrill, insistent. It cut through his grief like an omen. In his mind, it was a random noise. It was signal, warning, a call to arms. The fight had begun. That night, he picked up his phone and dialed her number. Jessica answered on the third ring, her voice steady, as if she had been expecting this. "Jess, that quilt isn't yours. It's my grandma's." A pause. He thought maybe she would apologize, maybe admit she'd packed it by mistake. But her reply was cold, rehearsed. "She gave it to both of us, Ethan. You can't just rewrite history." He clenched the phone tighter. "You know that's not true. It was mine before you moved in." "It's family," she sighed. "And I was family once." The line went quiet for a beat, the kind of silence that isn't empty but brimming with contempt. Ethan swallowed hard. "Jess, please, this isn't just fabric. It's—" She cut him off, voice sharp now. "You're making it bigger than it is. It's a blanket. I lived with it. I cared for it. It stayed warm in my apartment, too. That makes it mine as much as yours." Her words landed like ice water. "A blanket? Just a blanket?" To Ethan, it was as if she had spit on his grandmother's memory. "You're wrong," he said, his tone low, steady. "And one day, you'll see that." She laughed, the sound brittle, almost metallic. "Or maybe one day you'll see it doesn't matter." The call ended. In the following days, Ethan wandered his apartment like a man searching for air. The absence of the quilt screamed louder than the absence of Jessica herself. He found himself staring at the dust outline again and again, as if the ghost of fabric might return if he waited long enough. Sleep deserted him. At 3 in the morning, he sat on the edge of his bed, the glow of his laptop painting his face pale. The draft box opened automatically. His unsent status still lingered there. "How do you fight for love when love is no longer here?" He added a line beneath it. "How do you fight for memory when memory has been stolen?" His finger hovered over the post button. Again, he closed the laptop without sending. What gnawed at him was not just loss, but violation. This wasn't a fight about who kept the couch or the blender or the rent deposit. This was about something sacred, something never meant to be bartered or divided. A thought spiraled in his head. If she can take this from me, what's to stop anyone from taking from anyone? If love ends, does legacy become loot? The more he thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't private anymore. It wasn't simply an ex-girlfriend holding onto a keepsake. It was a reflection of a larger truth. In America, countless families fight to keep heirlooms, photographs, rings, recipes. And too often, those items are diminished by the courts, dismissed as trivial. Yet they are everything. The quilt was not just Ethan's battle. It was a symbol. a microcosm of every fight between love and law, memory and possession. Meanwhile, Jessica told the story differently. To her friends, over cocktails at a dim downtown bar, she laughed. "He called me about the quilt," she said, swirling her glass. "He sounded like I'd stolen his crown jewels." Her friend raised an eyebrow. "Isn't it important to him?" Jessica shrugged. "It's a blanket. And if I give it back, he wins. I don't lose. Simple as that." She smiled, but even her closest confidants noticed the edge in her voice. This wasn't about warmth or comfort. It was about control. The contrast between them sharpened. Ethan, grieving and sleepless, whispering to dust. Jessica, laughing under neon lights, treating memory as leverage. That was the trigger. The quilt had moved from fabric to fault line, from comforter to battlefield. The horn on the street outside that night had been right. The fight had begun. What seemed like a small personal dispute was now revealed as a national reckoning in miniature. When love ends, who owns the past? When relationships fracture, do heirlooms fracture too? The quilt was not fabric, it was a mirror. It reflected the fragility of memory when confronted by law, by pride, by power. For Ethan, the theft was unbearable because it wasn't just Jessica taking a blanket. It was Jessica taking his grandmother's hands, his childhood winters, his proof of belonging. For Jessica, keeping the quilt was less about comfort than about refusing to disappear. This collision of motives was the spark. And sparks, once struck, rarely fade quietly. At first, Ethan told himself to let it go. Friends urged him the same way. Over beers, over text messages, the advice always repeated. "It's just a blanket, man. Don't waste your energy. Move on." One colleague even joked, trying to lighten the mood. "Buy another quilt on Etsy. Get one custom made. Problem solved." Ethan would force a thin smile, but the words carved at him. How could they not see? This wasn't about cloth. It wasn't replaceable. He wanted to scream, "You can't buy the hands that sewed it. You can't buy the nights that carry me through storms." Instead, he stayed quiet, as he always did, and carried the weight alone. The photograph on his dresser became his anchor. Agnes Miller, hair tied in a neat bun, wrinkles folded into a permanent smile. Ethan found himself standing before it night after night, as though waiting for her to speak from the frame. He remembered her hands trembling slightly as she stitched, arthritis making every movement slow. But she never complained. She would hum old hymns, her needle dipping and rising like a heartbeat. "Why are you making it so big?" 12-year-old Ethan had once asked. "Because one day you'll need it," she answered. "And when you do, it should cover more than just your body. It should cover your whole life." Now, without it, he felt exposed, uncovered. The moment everything shifted came on a Sunday afternoon. His sister had brought her daughter Emily to visit. Emily was 7, wide-eyed, curious, with the blunt honesty only children could deliver. She wandered into his room and stopped at the open closet. "Uncle," she said, tilting her head, "where's Grandma's blanket?" "The colorful one." Ethan froze. His throat tightened. He knelt down to meet her gaze. She took it," he admitted softly. Emily frowned. "But it's Grandma's. Doesn't it come back here?" He couldn't answer. The silence stretched. Finally, she whispered the question that pierced him deeper than anything Jessica had ever said. "Uncle, will Grandma's blanket ever come back?" Something broke open in Ethan. Not anger, not yet, but resolve. He realized this wasn't just his loss. This was their family's memory. The quilt didn't belong folded in a stranger's apartment, framed as a trophy. It belonged where stories still lived, where children asked about it, where memory mattered. He drew in a shaky breath and said, almost to himself as much as to Emily, "She took fabric. But she won't take our story." Emily nodded as if satisfied and skipped back to the living room. Ethan stayed kneeling on the floor, fists clenched, his decision solidifying like cement. That night, Ethan took the photo of Agnes from the dresser. He slipped it into his bag, as though carrying a witness. The next morning, he walked into the office of Rachel Kim, a 31-year-old attorney whose reputation was rising quickly in Denver's legal circles. Rachel was known for two things: her sharp mind and her refusal to dismiss small cases. Where other lawyers saw petty disputes, she saw principles. Her office was modest, stacked files, half-empty coffee cups, but her eyes were sharp as they studied him. "So," she began, "tell me why you're here." Ethan hesitated. The words felt heavy, too sentimental for a courtroom. But then he reached into his bag and set Agnes's photo on the desk. "This isn't about fabric," he said quietly. "It's about legacy." Rachel leaned back, crossed her arms. "Go on," he told her everything. Jessica's departure, the missing quilt, the phone call, the dust outline in his closet, Emily's question. He spoke haltingly, as though each word cost him effort. By the end, his voice cracked. Rachel stayed silent for a long moment. Then she tapped the photo gently. "You're right. Courts don't always see memory. They see property. But property law has room for arguments about heirlooms, about intent, about legacy." She leaned forward, her voice firm now. "This isn't about fabric. It's about family. And if you're ready to fight, so am I." Ethan exhaled. For the first time in weeks, he felt something other than grief. He felt momentum. Walking out of her office, the city noise hit him like a wave horn's chatter, footsteps. Normally, he would have shrunk from it. That day, he welcomed it. Every sound seemed to mark the beginning of something larger. He imagined the quilt folded in Jessica's apartment, silent and misplaced. Soon, it would be called into the open. Soon, it would have its day. The turning point wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was a quiet resolve that hardened inside him, a shift from loss to pursuit. He was no longer the man whispering to dust in his closet. He was the man carrying his grandmother's voice into a courtroom. The decision to fight wasn't just personal. It reflected a larger truth, that heirlooms, though humble, carry weight equal to titles and deeds. Ethan's silence had been survival, but silence could no longer protect memory. His niece's question showed him the stakes. This wasn't about winning against Jessica. It was about ensuring a family's story wasn't erased. By seeking Rachel, Ethan transformed. He was no longer a grieving grandson. He became a legal warrior, armed not with aggression, but with truth. His grandmother's quilt had always been protection. Now it was also a cause. And as Rachel had said, this wasn't about fabric. It was about legacy. The case should have stayed small. A private dispute, a lawyer's filing, a judge's schedule. But in the 21st century, nothing private stays small, not when stories catch fire online. It began with a single tweet. A journalist covering the Denver courthouse posted a photo of the evidence bag, a folded quilt, faded but colorful, behind clear plastic. The caption read, "Man sues ex for keeping his grandmother's handmade quilt. He says it's family. She says it's property. Judge to decide." Within hours, the post went viral. People debated in threads, dozens of comments deep. Some mocked Ethan. Imagine suing over a blanket while others defended him fiercely. It's not fabric, it's family history. By nightfall, a hashtag appeared. Quilt Justice. The media latched on quickly. Local stations ran headlines like, "Denver man fights for family heirloom in unusual court case." National outlets followed, amplifying the human drama. Talk shows filled their panels with pundits dissecting the issue. On one popular morning show, a host leaned toward the camera and asked, "Is a quilt property or legacy? And if love ends, who gets to keep the past?" The panelists divided predictably. One dismissed Ethan as melodramatic. He's just bitter, trying to punish his ex through court. Another countered, "We undervalue heirlooms in this country. They're not just objects, they're archives." Clips circulated endlessly, shared with hashtags, clipped into memes. Jessica seized her moment. She had always been comfortable in the spotlight, and this case gave her a new stage. Speaking to a local reporter outside her apartment, she declared, "He's just bitter. I took what I was entitled to." Her words hit the headlines the next morning. To her, it was strategy frame. Ethan, as petty, herself as reasonable. But not everyone bought it. Then came the blogger. A young cultural critic wrote an essay titled, "Is Love Measured in Quilts?" on a popular site. The piece blended personal anecdote with sharp analysis. We treat heirlooms like trivial trinkets in legal battles, but they carry the marrow of memory. A quilt is not just sewn fabric. It is stitched identity. If Ethan loses, it will signal to every family that memory is disposable in the eyes of the law. The essay spread like wildfire, shared thousands of times. Teachers used it in classrooms. Podcasts quoted it. The hashtag Quilt Justice doubled in reach overnight. Feeling the tide shifting, Jessica struck back in the way she knew best: performance. She opened her phone, went live on Instagram. The screen framed her perfectly, hair slightly tousled, eyes rimmed with tears. Draped across her shoulders was the quilt itself, its colors dulled but still vivid under the ring light. Her voice trembled. "I cared for it more than he ever did. I washed it. I kept it warm. I loved it. And now he wants to erase me, to take even this away. Tell me, does that sound like justice?" Comments flooded in. And a hand, "I begs, poorst ires." Some praised her vulnerability. Others criticized her manipulation. The live stream racked up tens of thousands of views. But social media is a double-edged sword. Within hours, users dug up old photos from Ethan's private accounts. In one, he was hanging the quilt on a clothesline, sunbeams catching the fabric like stained glass. Another showed him kneeling beside his washing machine, carefully spreading the quilt across a drying rack. Side-by-side collages spread online with the caption, "Who really cared for it?" The narrative flipped. Jessica's tears looked staged. Ethan's quiet photos radiated authenticity. The backlash was swift. Commenters flooded her page. "This isn't yours. Give it back. You can't cry your way out of truth." Quilt Justice trended again, but this time the balance tilted decisively in Ethan's favor. Meanwhile, Ethan himself stayed silent. He avoided interviews, declined requests for comment, even ignored texts from reporters. When pressed, his lawyer Rachel released a single statement: "This case is not about bitterness. It's about legacy. It's about honoring the intent of family, not erasing it. We look forward to presenting evidence in court." The restraint made Ethan more sympathetic. While Jessica's live stream played like theater, his silence came across as dignity. People projected onto him the image of the quiet grandson protecting his grandmother's love. The conflict escalated beyond personal narratives. Law professors weighed in, debating whether heirlooms should have special legal protection. Opinion pieces appeared in newspapers coast to coast. Some argued courts shouldn't waste time on sentimental clutter. Others countered that the law's coldness toward memory revealed a deeper cultural sickness. One op-ed concluded, "When we dismiss heirlooms, we dismiss history. If we cannot honor memory in the courtroom, we cannot honor it anywhere." Third, the division in public opinion reflected a broader cultural split. On one side, those who believed Ethan was making too much of too little. People break up, stuff gets divided. Get over it. These voices often emphasized efficiency, rationality, property law. On the other side, those who saw in Ethan's struggle the universal fight to keep memory intact. We've all had something small that meant everything. To lose it is to lose a piece of yourself. The quilt became a cultural mirror. People argued not just about Ethan and Jessica, but about themselves, about their own heirlooms, their own breakups, their own fragile attachments. One night, scrolling reluctantly through headlines, Ethan stumbled on a comment that stopped him cold. It read, "I lost my mother's recipe box in a divorce. To the court, it was worth $0. To me, it was worth my childhood. I wish I had fought like Ethan." For the first time, he realized he was no longer just a grandson defending a quilt. He was becoming a symbol. That terrified him, but it also steeled him. The conflict had risen from personal pain to public spectacle. What began as dust in a closet now burned across screens nationwide. Jessica's attempt to weaponize perception backfired when her performance clashed with undeniable proof of Ethan's quiet care. This stage revealed not only the antagonist's motives, but society's fracture. Was memory expendable or sacred? Was property ownership absolute, or should law bend toward legacy? By the end of this rising conflict, the quilt no longer belonged only to Ethan and Jessica. It belonged to the conversation of a nation. The courtroom was already full before the judge arrived. Reporters packed the benches, their cameras pointed toward the clear plastic evidence bag on the table. Inside it lay the quilt folded tight, colors muted under fluorescent light, a silent witness waiting for its turn. The hum of voices filled the air until the bailiff shouted, "All rise." The room stood as the judge entered, black robe flowing, her gavel in hand. She settled into her chair, glanced at the crowded gallery, then struck wood on wood. Bang. Court is now in session. Rachel Kim, sharp in her navy suit, rose first. She moved with the confidence of someone who knew the weight of her words. She gestured toward the evidence bag. "This quilt," she began, voice steady, "carries the DNA of a family. It cannot be split. It cannot be sold. It belongs where it was born. With the grandson it was made for." The jury leaned forward. Rachel's cadence was deliberate, every word measured like a stitch. Across the aisle, Jessica's attorney stood. He was older, silver hair, practiced calm. "Possession," he countered, "is ownership. My client lived with it, cared for it, kept it safe. In the eyes of property law, that is enough." Murmurs rippled through the gallery. The judge raised a hand. "We'll hear evidence." The bailiff carefully lifted the evidence bag and, with latex gloves, unfolded the quilt onto the presentation table. Gasps scattered through the room. Up close, the colors came alive. Patches of red, blue, yellow, green, each square cut from some life already lived. A patch of denim worn pale at the knees. A square of floral print faded with time. Stitches crossing stitches, a web of care. Then something unexpected. A small square near the corner, slightly hidden by a fold, revealed embroidered letters. The thread was faded, but clear enough to read. E.M. The courtroom stilled. The courtroom stilled. The judge leaned forward. Jurors whispered. Rachel let the silence linger before she spoke. "E.M.," she said softly. "Ethan Miller, stitched by his grandmother's own hand." The gallery erupted in murmurs again until the judge's gavel silenced them. Rachel turned to the jury. This quilt was never meant as community property. It was personal, intentional, an heirloom created for one person. This embroidery is proof. Jessica shifted in her chair, jaw tightening. When Ethan took the witness stand, the room seemed to hold its breath. He sat stiffly, hands clasped, eyes on the quilt. Rachel approached. "Mr. Miller, tell us what this quilt means to you." He swallowed hard. His voice trembled at first, but steadied with each word. "It's not fabric. It's my grandmother's hands. Every patch is a piece of my family. My mother's flannel, my uncle's shirts, her own Sunday dress. She made it for me when I was 12. She told me, 'One day, this will keep you warm when I can't.'" He paused, blinking back tears. She died when I was 19. This quilt was all I had left. It kept me safe through storms, through college, through nights I couldn't sleep. His eyes met the jury. Silence doesn't keep memories safe. Proof does. This quilt is my proof of her love. The line hung in the air, electric. Reporters' pens scratched furiously. Some jurors shifted, visibly moved. Rachel let the words settle, then said gently, "No further questions." Jessica's attorney rose. His tone was crisp, dismissive. "Mr. Miller, isn't it true that when Ms. Hart lived with you, she also used the quilt?" "Yes," Ethan admitted. "So it was shared, wasn't it? Not exclusively yours." Ethan hesitated. "She slept under it, but that didn't make it hers." The attorney pressed. "And did your grandmother ever put in writing that this quilt was to belong to you?" "No." "Then what we have is sentimental attachment, not legal ownership." He turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, the law cannot run on sentiment." When Jessica took her turn, the mood shifted. She was composed, poised, her hair perfectly arranged. She glanced at the jury with practiced vulnerability. "I cared for it more than he ever did," she said, voice soft. "I washed it. I kept it clean. I loved it. To me, it wasn't just his grandmother's quilt. It was ours. We were family. And when our relationship ended, I didn't want to lose everything. Keeping it was my way of holding on to something." Some jurors nodded faintly, empathizing. The performance was effective. Rachel rose for cross-examination. Her questions cut sharper. "Ms. Hart, did you embroider the letters E.M. into the quilt?" Jessica shifted. "No." "Did you sew any part of it?" "No." "Then what claim do you have other than possession?" Jessica bristled. "I lived with it. I cared for it. That should count." Rachel leaned in. "So you admit your only basis is possession?" Jessica snapped, her control slipping. "Yes, I kept it because I could, because it hurts him more that way." The words spilled before she could stop them. The gallery gasped. The judge's gavel pounded. Order. But the damage was done. The silence after Jessica's outburst was deafening. Reporters froze mid-note. Jurors stared at her, eyes narrowing. Rachel didn't need to say much. She turned slowly to the jury, letting the moment speak for itself. "You heard her," she said simply. "This was never about care. It was about control." Ethan sat quietly, his eyes damp but steady. He looked at Jessica, then at the quilt, and finally at the judge. "This quilt," he whispered again, "isn't fabric. It's family." Rachel's closing argument was surgical. Possession is not love. Control is not legacy. This quilt was stitched for Ethan Miller with his initials sewn into its very fabric. To keep it from him is not preservation. It is theft, not of property, but of memory. She let her gaze sweep across the jury. If we treat memory as disposable, then none of us can trust the law to protect what matters most. Today, you decide whether legacy has value. Jessica's attorney tried to recover ground, appealing to logic. We cannot turn every sentimental item into a legal battle. If we do, the courts will drown in memories. The law must stand on possession, and possession is hers. But his words felt hollow after Jessica's outburst. The jury deliberated only 2 hours. When they returned, the foreperson's voice was clear. "We find in favor of the plaintiff, Ethan Miller. The quilt is recognized as a family heirloom and is to be returned immediately." Gasps, murmurs, flashes. Ethan closed his eyes, tears slipping down his face. Rachel squeezed his shoulder. Jessica sat stone still, lips pressed tight, her spotlight gone. The climax was not in the shouting, not even in Rachel's eloquence. It was in Jessica's slip. Law is often shaped not by grand speeches, but by a single careless truth. Her admission, "I kept it because it hurts him," tipped the scales more than any document could. And the quilt itself, with its faint embroidered E.M., became the final witness. Proof, not silence, carried the day. The judge's voice carried through the hushed courtroom. "This quilt is an heirloom. It returns to Mr. Miller." One final strike of the gavel sealed the decision. Bang. The room erupted, not in cheers, but in the clicking frenzy of cameras, in the rush of reporters filing headlines. Ethan barely heard it. His eyes locked on the quilt now placed before him. With trembling hands, he lifted it out of the evidence bag, pressing it to his chest. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to cry openly. Tears traced down his face, falling onto the worn fabric as though baptizing it anew. Across the aisle, Jessica sat rigid, lips drawn tight, her expression unreadable. But when the bailiff announced court adjourned, she stood slowly, almost mechanically, and walked toward the exit. By the time Ethan stepped outside with Rachel at his side, the news had already spread. Phones buzzed, headlines flashed across screens. "She kept his grandma's quilt." Judge said, "It's not yours." The phrase repeated everywhere, on television banners, online articles, push notifications. It crystallized the story into a single line, a line that would follow Jessica for months, maybe years. Outside the courthouse, the air was thick with lights and microphones. The crowd pressed forward as Ethan emerged, quilt folded carefully in his arms. Flashbulbs exploded. Voices shouted questions. But Ethan said nothing. He kept his eyes low, his grip firm. Rachel offered a brief statement on his behalf. This verdict honors legacy. It shows that memory matters, that heirlooms are not disposable. We thank the court for recognizing that truth. Reporters scribbled. Cameras rolled. Ethan's silence, coupled with the sight of him clutching the quilt, became its own testimony, more powerful than any speech. Minutes later, Jessica walked out. For the first time, the cameras turned not as an invitation, but as judgment. The microphones thrust toward her, but no one asked a question. The crowd waited, daring her to speak, but she didn't. She paused on the courthouse steps, frozen in the blinding glare of lights. Then something eerie happened. The microphone shifted slowly away from her, pointed toward the ground, toward silence. The only sound was the faint rustle of a reporter flipping through a printed copy of the verdict, the pages snapping in the wind. Jessica descended the steps alone. The spotlight she had once courted now revealed only her isolation. In that moment, justice wasn't just the judge's words. It was the image of two opposites. Ethan holding history close, and Jessica stranded in noise that no longer listened. Justice revealed itself not only in a courtroom ruling, but in collective recognition. The root must return to its soil. Online, the fallout surged. The hashtag #QuiltJustice was quickly overtaken by a new phrase, "Not yours." At first, it was simply a summary of the judge's ruling, but it morphed into something larger, a rallying cry against the taking of sentimental items during breakups. People shared their own stories. X kept my dad's vinyl records. They were his, not ours, not yours. She walked away with my grandmother's recipe cards. Judge said it didn't matter. It mattered. Not yours. Cass, we need more rulings like Ethan's. Family legacy isn't community property. Not yours. The hashtag trended for weeks. Think pieces multiplied. Legal blogs debated whether the case would influence future family law rulings. Some suggested courts might begin to treat heirlooms differently, carving out exceptions for items proven to be legacy. Back home, Ethan unfolded the quilt across his bed. The room felt different with it there, fuller, warmer, as though the air itself recognized its return. He sat on the edge of the mattress, fingers tracing the stiffed initials. E. M now forever a piece of evidence, and yet more importantly, a piece of love. He whispered, "I brought you home, Grandma." The quilt lay heavy across his lap, not as a burden but as a shield, a reminder that silence could finally rest. Jessica retreated from the public eye. Her social media went quiet. PR clients distanced themselves. To many, she had become the face of petty cruelty. Her careless outburst replayed endlessly. I kept it because it hurts him more that way. The woman who once thrived on image now found herself framed by absence. When she walked into bars she used to own with laughter, conversations hushed. People recognized her, but no one asked for selfies anymore. Fame had curdled into infamy. Her punishment was not prison, not fines. It was irrelevance, magnified by memory. The case became more than gossip fodder. It became a parable. Professors cited it in lectures about property law. Psychologists discussed it in talks about grief and attachment. Families whispered about it at dinner tables, suddenly remembering the heirlooms tucked in closets, rings, quilts, letters, and wondering what would happen if those were ever contested. Justice had not only restored a quilt, it had restored a cultural truth. Memory is not merchandise. Weeks later, a journalist wrote in a reflective column, "The moment that stayed with me wasn't the judge's gavel. It was when Jessica stood alone on the courthouse steps, cameras flashing, microphones angled toward silence. In that quiet, society answered, 'Not yours, not ever.'" Thu. The courthouse dust had barely settled when Ethan returned to his apartment. The city outside still buzzed with headlines, hashtags, debates, but inside his walls, there was only stillness. He placed his keys on the table, unwrapped the quilt from the protective bag, and held it once more. For a long moment, he just stood there, breathing it in, as though every square carried the echo of a heartbeat. Then, slowly, he folded it with careful hands. Each crease was deliberate, like a prayer. He lifted the lid of an old wooden chest that had once belonged to his grandmother. Inside lay faded letters, photographs, and now, finally, the quilt, back where it belonged. He lowered it gently, smoothed the fabric, and closed the chest. He locked it with a small brass key, whispered into the silence, "I brought you home, Grandma." Weeks later, Ethan agreed to speak at a small community center. Rachel stood beside him, a stack of notes in her hands, though she hardly needed them. The room was filled with neighbors, students, elders, some who had followed the trial, others who simply came because they too had an heirloom waiting quietly at home. Ethan approached the podium nervous at first. Public speaking had never been his strength, but when he looked out at the rows of expectant faces, he remembered the jury, the press, the strangers who had rallied to his cause. He cleared his throat. "Power with no honor is just noise," he said. His voice was steady, almost solemn. "Lead loud, even when you whisper." The words rippled through the room. People leaned in, as if the sentence itself carried a warmth like the quilt he had fought for. Rachel stepped forward to add her own truth. Negligence isn't an accident. It's injustice waiting to happen. We must never dismiss memory as trivial, because when we do, we dismiss the people who gave us those memories. Applause filled the hall, not wild but resonant, like a chorus agreeing in unison. In the weeks that followed, the story refused to fade. Schools used it in ethics lessons. Law professors cited it as precedent in discussions of property and heirlooms. Churches and community groups told it as a parable about legacy. But Ethan's life was quieter. He returned to work, tapping at keyboards, fixing broken code. Coworkers greeted him with new respect, but he didn't dwell on it. He slipped back into routine, grateful that his days no longer swirled with cameras and microphones. And yet, something in him had changed. He no longer carried silence as a shield. He carried it as a choice. A man who had once hidden from noise had learned that whispers, when spoken with truth, could shake a courtroom. Jessica vanished from public view. Her once active feeds lay dormant. PR clients stopped calling. In the vacuum, she became less a person and more a cautionary tale. How arrogance can consume legacy, how control without honor leaves only silence. She wasn't remembered for her polished words, her crafted persona, or even her tears on livestream. She was remembered for one sentence. She wished she had never spoken. I kept it because it hurts him more that way. That line became a warning, quoted in essays and lectures as the turning point where power stripped itself bare. For Ethan, the case was never about spectacle. It was about returning a quilt to its rightful place. And yet, the ripples extended far beyond him. The verdict became a symbol of something larger, that justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it folds quietly into a wooden chest, waiting for the next generation to open it. A journalist later wrote, "Justice is not always loud. Sometimes it is stitched quietly into the fabric of legacy, revealed only when someone dares to protect it." K. Months later, a documentary crew visited Ethan's apartment. They filmed him at his desk, in his kitchen, finally at the wooden chest. He opened it carefully for the camera, unfolded the quilt, and draped it across his lap. The director whispered, "Do you see the flaw? The small tear?" Ethan nodded, tracing the loose thread. "Yes." The camera zoomed close. One seam had unraveled slightly, a gap where light streamed through. Sunlight from the window pierced the hole, creating a streak of brightness across the faded cloth. Ethan smiled faintly. "It's a wound, but it's also a window." The quilt, imperfect and scarred, told the story better than any verdict. Through its frayed threads, light entered like hope through loss, justice through silence. As the documentary wrapped, Ethan turned once more to the camera. "Power with no honor is just noise," he said quietly. "Lead loud, even when you whisper." Rachel, standing beside him, added her own closing line. "Justice isn't fabric, but sometimes it's stitched into one." The screen faded to black. And the story lingered, not as fireworks, not as celebration, but as the quiet certainty that even a simple quilt could carry the weight of. Justice.